Question for short debate, British-Iran relations. Time limit is 1 hour. Lord Alton of Liverpool.
My Lords, and thank you all Member Lords who speak today. I begin by saying I wish more time was available for an extended parliamentary debate. I should also record, for the sake of transparency, that the Noble Lord Polak and I are both sanctioned by the Iranian regime. Key issues that the House will want the Minister to address will include Iran's reported ability to have enriched uranium to levels just short of the threshold for making a nuclear bomb. We'll want to hear about its supply of drones to Putin for his use in the illegal war in Ukraine, about its support for regional proxies destabilising the region, not least for the Houthis in Yemen, where an estimated 150,000 people have been killed in the war, including 10,000 children, about the malign activities of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard inside and outside of Iran, and the continued, lamentable, dismal failure to prescribe it, about abductions and extrajudicial killings, including of UK citizens, and the increasing use of the death penalty, about the decision this week of the Iran International Independent TV station to leave London because of threats to its staff, along with similar systematic targeting of BBC Persian staff and their families, about the shocking, ill-timed cuts to the BBC Persian services when there are widespread protests sweeping the country, heroically initiated by defiant women, and when the need for the flow of reliable news rather than propaganda has never been greater. And we'll hear about the systematic abuse of human rights, not least for political and religious beliefs, including Baha'is and Christians, whose beliefs don't conform to those of Iran's repressive, theocratic regime. Turning first to the issue of nuclear proliferation, the inspectors for the International Atomic Energy Agency say levels of enriched uranium at Iran's nuclear sites are now just 6% below the threshold for a nuclear weapon. In a week during which North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, it was indeed disturbing to read that their brothers in arms in Iran are also developing comparable technology with direct application to intermediate and intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Back in 2021, in the Integrated Review, the United Kingdom asserted that with its allies it would, and I quote, hold Iran to account for its nuclear activity. I'd be grateful if the Noble Lord, the Minister, could tell us when the update of the review will be completed, explain what we mean by accountability, how we intend to respond to these most recent developments, and what it meant when we say we remain, again I quote, open to talks on a more comprehensive nuclear and regional deal, not least in the context of President Biden's reported remarks that the JCPOA is dead. And in any event, my lords, why should we believe anything this regime says or promises? They told the world that their centrifuges could only enrich uranium to a 60% level of purity, as their total enrichment of uranium stockpiles now exceeds JCPOA limits by at least 18 times. It's patently clear that this is not a regime whose word counts for anything. The risks to world peace, including an existential risk to the state of Israel, are obvious. On September the 12th, Israel's Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, displayed a map depicting the Syrian location of 10 production facilities for mid- and long-range precise missiles and weapons that Iran had provided to Hezbollah and Iranian proxies. Now, in commenting on that, I hope the Minister can also tell us how we've responded to Iran's provision of unmanned aerial vehicles, Mohajer 6 drones and Shahed 131 and 136 drones, which target civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, aiding and abetting Putin's brutal war crimes, in which Iran is now implicated and complicit, and for which it should be held to account and ultimately prosecuted. As an Iranian delegation was in Moscow last month discussing the building of a factory to mass manufacture zones. Are we seized, my lords, of the urgency in recognising the deepening military and economic ties between Russia, Iran and the PRC, everything from satellites to grain to drones and to joint military exercises in the Gulf? As for the axis with Putin, it was reported in The Guardian last week, I quote, "The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has been at the forefront of the growing bond, with senior leaders Khalil Mohammed-Zadeh, Suleiman Hamidi, and Ali Shamkhani playing central roles in the drone exports to Russia." In response, just how effective does the noble lord believe that more than 50 sanctions designations imposed because of military support for Putin or as a consequence of human rights have actually been? And are we considering further sanctions? And my lords, beyond sanctions, is it correct that the FCDO has blocked a Home Office attempt to prescribe the IRGC? And is that because of German reluctance to do the same? As I asked on January the 18th in the House, following the execution of Ali Reza Akbari, what has to happen? What further evidence is needed before they are prescribed? Such executions and death penalties are not new in Iran. It's long ranked amongst the world's top executioners, often on the back of hasty sham trials. In 2021, it executed 314 people, 20% more than in 2020. There are estimates that differ for 2022, but dozens are facing protests-related executions. Perhaps the noble lord can give us the FCDO estimates, including the numbers of children who have been executed. As for the sham trials and what passes for justice, Tara Seperi-Farr of Human Rights Watch says this: "Defendants are systematically deprived of access to lawyers and are subjected to torture and coerced confessions, then rushed to the gallows." Not that we should be surprised, my lords, given the role of President Ibrahim Raisi in 1988 in the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, predominantly from Mrs. Rajavi's pro-democracy resistance. Executions have been used to try and frighten people who've been protesting since the death in September of 22-year-old Mahsa Jina Amini while in the custody of the nation's morality police. It was the spark that ignited a nationwide revolt against the theocratic regime, and in many cases led by young women, turning on its head the stereotypes about the nature of opposition within Iran. Mahsa had been arrested for improperly wearing her hijab, and according to her family and local media, severely beaten. She died 3 days later while still in police custody. Protests then erupted across Iran, led by women who tore off their hijabs, cut their hair, and adopted a rallying cry of women, life, freedom. How bitterly ironic that Iran, until it was expelled in December, had a place on the United Nations Women's Committee. According to the UN Office of Human Rights, protesters are facing the so-called crime of waging war against God, or Moharbe, and corruption on earth. Agnes Callamand of Amnesty International says the Iranian authorities knowingly decided to harm or kill people who took to the streets to express their anger at decades of repression and injustice. She said countless more faced being killed, maimed, tortured, sexually assaulted or thrown behind bars, and that the international community needs to go beyond mere statements of condemnation. The sheer courage is striking, my lords. Reports of what happened to Mahsa Amini emerged in part thanks to reporters Nilufar Hamedi and Elaha Mohammadi, whom the Iranian regime, of course, then subsequently jailed. These brave young women could now themselves face the death penalty, but their journalism isn't crime. By the end of 2022, there were 363 known cases of detained journalists. Article 19 is abused every day in Iran. As it tops the world's League of Executioners, Iran also tops the League of Jailing Journalists, which takes me to the BBC. I sometimes wonder whether ministers truly understand the smart power of the BBC World Services. Certainly the Iranian regime must do, or they wouldn't be threatening BBC journalists and their families. Following the debate I secured on cuts to the BBC's global news services and a meeting along with Baroness Browning with the FCDO Minister David Rutley, this week I met Liliane Lander, the Director of BBC World Services. On each occasion, I've raised my concerns about the despicable treatment of BBC Persian journalists, which is of a piece with the driving out of Iran International from London. But I've also contested the shocking decision of the FCDO to cut the BBC Persian radio service. BBC services being cut does exactly what the regime wants the FCDO and the BBC to do, and in the scheme of things, it makes very small savings. I know my noble friend Lady Cousins will return to this issue. But in summary, my lords, 1.6 million Iranians still get their news via radio, and dictators can far more easily close down internet services. Long-term funding of the BBC World must be addressed, but in the short term, Persian radio services should not be allowed to close. Its voice, and the voices of those who want to see the emergence of a more just and democratic society based on the rule of law, must not be silenced. And in this debate today, we must reiterate our support and raise our voices for the people of Iran.
My lords, for many years I've been associated directly and indirectly with Iran. I visited many of the Iranian cities and have a great affection and respect for the Iranian people. And I'm very keen to try to help them in finding and getting them medicines and essential equipment and other humanitarian help. It's my understanding that the acute lack of essential food and health commodities in Iran are in great part due to the gap between the Iranian and the international banking systems. This is reflected by Iran's non-adherence to the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, and this is one of the main obstacles preventing the Iranian banking system from joining the global banking community. As it appears unlikely that this problem can be resolved in the short term, the need seems obvious for an approved secure banking channel to be established for the uninterrupted supply of essential goods to the Iranian population, regardless of the international political environment. Multiple solutions have, of course, been proposed over recent years and haven't gained much traction or success. However, I'm aware of a Swiss proposal initiated by a former senior United States oversight official in the Washington area, and his Swiss-based colleague has received the preliminary blessing from the relevant US department which handles such issues. Would the Minister agree to sit down with me and the sponsors of the Swiss proposal to understand its merits? My understanding is that the proposal could easily incorporate other interested actors such as Qatar, to whom an invitation has already been extended to participate, and would be operational in a matter of days, provided appropriate approvals are received. This could mean the possibility of delivering medicines and other essential goods during the Iranian New Year period that starts next month and would make an immediate and meaningful impact.
My Lords, let me thank Lord Alton of Liverpool for this debate. The United States government classifies the Islamic Republic of Iran as the foremost state sponsor of terrorism, alleging that Iran provides a range of support, including finance, training, and equipment to terrorist groups around the world. How else could we explain the use of Iranian drones in Ukraine or the security of some of the countries in the Middle East? In recent days, we are seeing a democratic revolution fully supported by Iranian people. This is a revolution against the mullahs, the likes of which we have never seen before. Over 750 people have been killed, and according to Iranian opposition People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, I have seen some similar evidence of the attacks on resistance fighters in Camp Ashraf, where they sought shelter. I have seen the video evidence of hanging of women and children on cranes in Tehran. There is one change in protest marches that are now taking place. It's a revolution carried out mostly by Iranian women. My Lords, democratic rule is perfectly possible in Iran. Mr. Mariam Rajavi leads the pro-democracy Iranian opposition coalition. It has produced a 10-point plan. It has widespread support in both houses in UK Parliament and parliaments in many parts of the world. She mentions the rule of law and proper and fair elections as essentials. Briefly, she talks establishing a democratic, secular and non-nuclear republic. I make a plea to our minister, invite Mrs. Rajavi to London to meet our government in Iranians living in the United Kingdom.
My Lords, the people of Iran are entitled to have good relations with the people of the United Kingdom. However, I would argue the current government of Iran is absolutely not entitled to have good relations with His Majesty's government. May I commend my friend Hillel Nuya, the indefatigable director of UN Watch, the human rights NGO based in Geneva. He has been holding the Iranian regime to account and headed the campaign to remove Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women in 2022. And I thank my noble friend, the Minister, for taking such a strong lead on that issue. And my noble friend, I hope, will forgive me because I do not have enough time to list all the reasons why the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps should be prescribed as a terror group. Perhaps I will just ask the Minister in his response to furnish the House with the reason why the government has not prescribed the IRGC as a terror group. My Lords, Hillel, who I referred to, is rightly campaigning now that when the Iranian Foreign Minister addresses the UN Human Rights Council next Monday, on the 27th of February, that UN delegations should walk out and protest. Global figures have joined that campaign, like Masih Alinejad, the exiled Iranian women's rights activist who the regime attempted to assassinate in New York last summer. So I urge my noble friend, the Minister, to lead once again and take a strong stance against a regime that tortures, that kills and hangs its own people. My Lords, if, as we do, we stand for the protection of human rights, then my noble friend should stand and leave the room when the Iranian Foreign Minister begins to speak.
My Lords, I also congratulate my noble friend Lord Alton on achieving this very important debate. I will use the short time available to give a personal message from Christian Iranian asylum seekers based near my home in Witney who've become friends. And I quote from these people, and these are their words, not mine. Our Iranian friends are losing their lives for the simplest human rights of a person. At the risk of making their voice known to the world, they've come to the streets, and they only protested. But the answer to their protest was gunshots, prison, and execution. In the last 4 months, more than 1,000 people have been killed in Iran. Many of their bodies have not been handed over to their families. Many have been executed, and several hundred innocent children have died. And I just continue with their words. Now we have only one request to the British people. Please help us so that the voice of the people of Iran is heard, because in our country there is nothing but oppression, torture, and imprisonment, oppression of women, and shutting the mouths of young people. My country smells of blood, the smell of the blood of my brothers and sisters who only wanted nothing but the cry of freedom in the street. I end that quotation. My Lords, these poignant words provide a painful, powerful endorsement of the purpose of this debate, and I hope that the horrific persecution of minorities in the regime in Iran is something that the Minister will be able to address in his reply.
My Lords, I would like to thank the noble Lord Alton for obtaining this debate, for his superb introductory talk, and not least for his powerful call that we should oppose the persecution of Baha'is and Christians. I want to raise just two issues in the few moments I have. Firstly, as we're conducting British-Iranian relations, it's vitally important that we support loudly and clearly those who are demonstrating for their freedoms and in particular those who are facing most opposition, the young and the women who are being opposed by their very own government. They're rightly demonstrating for freedom of speech, for a right to an education and to have a job. Now, it's difficult to know exactly how many people have been caught up in the demonstrations, though it's widely reported. Between 600 and 800 protesters have been killed, more than 30,000 have been arrested, and more than 40 protesters so far executed. And those are probably very modest figures. So I'd like to echo Lord Alton's question to the Minister. What attempts are being made to record the regime's crimes so they can be taken to the UN Security Council? What representations has His Majesty's government made to the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran? Does the Minister agree that the Supreme Leader Khamenei and President Ebrahim Raisi should be held to account? Secondly, just a few words about the vital importance of the BBC Persian service, which the Noble Lord Alderman has already referred to, which has a weekly estimated audience of 1.6 million people. My Lords, the BBC Radio Persian service only costs around £800,000 a year. It's appalling that the BBC Persian staff are being targeted, especially women journalists. Those Iranian journalists working here in the UK find their families back in Iran are being threatened, sometimes arrested and interrogated. Iran has a systematic program of media censorship. They block Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, among others, and at critical times they shut down the entire internet. So the only source of independent reporting comes via the radio. The official state media does not report on the demonstrations, and if, as it's reported, and if the BBC does withdraw its service, then they would just be delighted that one further voice has been removed. Surely this is the very time when we need to continue to support those who are beleaguered by their own state by ensuring unbiased reporting of events in that country. Would the Noble Lord the Minister make urgent representations to his, on behalf of His Majesty's Government to reverse this very unfortunate decision on the BBC Radio Persian service?
My Lords, I'm delighted to follow the Right Reverend Prelate and to talk about the matters he talked to. My noble friend Lord Alton's welcome and timely debate invites us to address the issue of what should be the government's priorities for British-Iranian relations. I'd have no hesitation at naming the reversal of the lamentable decision to close down BBC Persia's radio service as having the short-term top priority. Why so? Firstly, because it would be one of the few actions our government could take of its own volition to reach out to Iran's citizens in a period when they are going through great stresses and difficulties and are deprived of fair and accurate information. Secondly, because while I've listened carefully to the BBC's and the government's explanations justifying the closure of BBC Persian's radio broadcasts, I find them totally unconvincing. It is true that the radio audience is smaller compared to that of other media channels, but what alternatives will that audience have when they are deprived of radio, which do not put them at increased risk and cost? Thirdly, and most importantly, why on earth is a step being taken which will only give delight to those who oppress Iranian citizens and deprive them of objective information, a step which they will surely hail as a victory? So I very much hope that the Noble Lord the Minister, when he replies to the debate, will tell us that this regrettable closure will not now proceed, with the cost of maintaining the radio service being met as an addition to the FCDO's block grant to the BBC's overseas services. In conclusion, I will mention one other priority, a long-standing one, the currently stagnant negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, aimed at reviving the JCPOA. The government is, in my view, to be congratulated in persevering with this effort, unpromising though the present circumstances are. To abandon it would merely give pleasure to the hardliners in Iran who have always sought to undermine the JCPOA. To abandon it without any alternative course of ensuring that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon would be folly. This debate should certainly not pass without paying tribute to the courage and determination of those in Iran who continue to demonstrate their rejection of oppression. Could the Noble Lord the Minister say why refugees fleeing from Iran are not on the list of countries receiving expedited treatment for asylum claims? Surely they should be, irrespective of how they get here.
My Lords, freedom is a precious commodity, but nobody knows with any degree of certainty where and by when the situation in Iran will finally lead. But the people of Iran have sent an indisputable message to the mullahs and the Revolutionary Guard that enough is enough and that their time is up. The people must always come first, and indicators are that the wind is in their sails. Arabian, Middle Eastern, near neighbour states are already pushing back against regime change, but now is the time for the government in London to become more assertive and be on the right side of history by supporting root and branch change from corruption, illegal imprisonment, capital punishment, confiscation of homes, and the wealth of the nation pillaged. Since the regime controlled the economy, joining the Revolutionary Guard is an assured way to advance in a difficult life exacerbated by crippling sanctions. A long-term necessity is that the conditions are such that the economy can be opened up to the benefit of all. The new generation within the IRGC are far removed from the original purpose of the Islamic Revolution, and given the incentive to do so, lower ranks could come out as sympathetic to the uprising, given that the regime is recognizing now as being so unpopular. The flight of capital from the country by senior members of the government is testament that the end could be near. A note of caution, however. The Islamic Republic has a strong lobby outside Iran, most particularly in Washington. A certain leftist ex-prime minister is being groomed to take over the mantle, and if this ploy be successful, will serve as a puppet of the regime by implementing cosmetic change only. The Women Life Freedom movement has not yet found a single voice and should be encouraged to do so post-haste in the same manner Khamenei orchestrated in 1979 with the uniting of disparate factions. My Lords, there is a consensus in Iran that the West are not doing sufficient. However, I remain of the belief that the leadership will buckle when faced with continued condemnation and pressure. But frankly speaking, everything hinges on the strategic support the uprising receives from the United Kingdom government and others. My Lords, I join with others by saving my concluding remark in matters relating to the pending BBC closure, and can do no better other than to join the dots with what I said the other day in the Chamber, and I quote, "Our foreign policy and strategy should deem this an entirely illogical move," and went on, and I quote, "Closure will send conflicting messages about the support we have in this country for the uprising."
It's a pleasure to follow the Noble Viscount, and I join with others in thanking the Noble Lord, Lord Alton, for securing this important debate. My Lords, which of us can ever forget the inspiring inauguration of the first black president of the United States only 14 years ago, or the soaring rhetoric of that momentous day, when in reference to the unalienable rights enshrined in the American Constitution, he declared, "Today we continue a never-ending journey to bridge the meaning of those words with the realities of our time. For history tells us that while these truths may be self-evident, they've never been self-executing." How right he was, because passivity never pays. He also said, war does not need to be perpetual. Again, he was absolutely right, of course. But surely if the last 14 years teach us anything, it's that vigilance and resolve do need to be exactly that, perpetual. Because appeasement always comes at a price. And what a price the world could be about to pay for the audacity to hope that diplomacy would work with a regime so disdainful of any values, any truths other than what the Ayatollahs decree. Whether it's terrorism abroad, or even the tone, as we've already heard, against its own people, the threat to our values is real. My lords, all eyes may be on Ukraine as the criminal invasion by Russia enters its second year on Friday. But the global destabilisation threat posed by Iran is potentially even more dangerous. As we've heard, Iranian nuclear breakout is imminent. My lords, that is the new reality of our time, which sadly no amount of rhetoric will bridge. In conclusion, given that global security must be our number one priority, I hope my noble friend the Minister knows that he and the government can count on the support of many noble lords when appropriate military action to prevent that threat materialising is taken. For all our sakes, I hope it is taken swiftly.
My Lords, the noble Lord Alton is our moral compass in international affairs. How fitting, then, is his choice of subject today. This is a regime that has rewarded the attacker of Salman Rushdie and teaches its children to engage with martyrdom, the Islamic Revolution, and to call for the death of America and death to Israel. But the gravest danger is its nuclear program in violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is not joint because the US withdrew. It is not comprehensive because there are loopholes and sunset clauses, for example, only a 10-year limit on centrifuges. It is not a plan because there's no strategy to prevent the development of an Iranian bomb, and it's not action because the IAEA cannot monitor or obtain accurate intelligence about Iran's nuclear activity. It has amounted to a waste of time because Iran has never given up on its plan to develop nuclear weapons, and it seems to us that it is not bound by that agreement. Uranium purified to 84% has reportedly been traced. Even at 60%, there is no peaceful use for that uranium. And if Israel is provoked into a strike, the consequences could be world-threatening. The government should be insisting on snapback sanctions, albeit that they too expire in 2025. Iran is in breach of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 by supplying Russia with drones used to attack Ukraine. It is the cause of destabilization right across the Middle East, supporting Assad, the rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza. How tragic that Syria appeals for assistance in the aftermath of the earthquake, and yet is funded for warfare by Iran to the tune of billions. Unfortunately, snapback sanctions would not hit Iran's dealing in oil with China. But sanctions hitting the Iranian people may, however, lead to that day when the government is finally overthrown due to the miseries inflicted on its own people. Will the government assure this House that the JCPOA is dead and that pre-JCPOA international arms restrictions should be restored? Will it downgrade diplomatic relations and close the Islamic Centre of England, which allegedly, in effect, represents Iran's supreme leader?
My Lords, I endorse everything my noble friend Lord Alton said in opening this debate about the treatment of protesters in Iran, especially women and girls, and so will use my time just to support and emphasise what's already been said so forcefully by others on the importance of preserving the BBC's Persian radio service and the need to step up our intervention to stop the threats, persecution and violence being experienced by its staff in London and their families in Iran. I know the Minister has heard it all before, not least from me, but I make no apology for repeating a little of what I said in our debate on the World Service in December, because A, things have got significantly worse, and B, there is an immediate window of opportunity to do the right thing and reverse the decision to scrap the Persian radio service on the 26th of March. I do get the overall case for going digital, but there are situations in which digital only can't be right, and this is surely one of them. The latest review of the World Service asserted that it would, and I quote, serve audiences during moments of jeopardy, with access to vital news services using appropriate broadcast and distribution platforms. The jeopardy in Iran includes the internet being restricted or blocked, so reliance on old-school radio may be the best or the only way to provide access to those vital news services. And we know from the most recent data that 1.6 million people a week get their news from Persian Service Radio, which is around 8% of its total audience. But the impact of the radio service is far more significant than those superficially modest figures suggest, because it's the morning radio output that feeds the TV and digital news content. Closing the radio service would mean that BBC Persian TV would not have any scheduled live news programming for 17 hours a day, creating the space for other, less balanced outlets with rather less palatable values and interests to fill that gap. My lords, as others have said, why hand the Iranian authorities a gift on a plate? Closing down BBC coverage of what's going on in Iran is exactly what they want. A victory for them, but a tragic loss of a lifeline of information and of hope to the millions of Iranians who suffer under their regime, and all for the cost saving of only £800,000 a year. So I ask the noble Lord the Minister if he will commit today to 3 clear actions: to reverse the decision to close the radio service, to fund the shortfall, and to step up both the diplomatic and the hard measures to protect the Persian Service staff in London and their families in Iran. This would give the Iranian resistance what they, and ultimately we too, need and value.
My Lords, it's a pleasure as always to follow my friend, the noble Lady Baroness Cousins, and I endorse all of the points she made and the very specific requests for information. I hope the Minister is able to respond very clearly to those. And I commend the noble Lord Alton for securing this debate. And as he and others have pointed out, we're debating the policy and the practice of persecution of the government of Iran, not the Iranian people, many of which, including those who have humbled us all, of women and girls who have been extraordinarily brave in the face of this persecution, as many noble lords have mentioned. And we have seen the death penalty and torture used as a policy of intimidation, and this is obvious. It was very welcome that the UN Commission on the Status of Women had expelled Iran. It was disappointing to see the countries who the UK rely on in many aspects of trade and diplomacy to abstain in that decision, including those that are part of the Abraham Accords and our Gulf allies. Secondly, it was also welcome that Iran is now subject to an investigation of the UN Human Rights Council. Similarly, the countries abstained who this country considers to be very close diplomatic allies. What work are we doing with our Gulf allies to ensure that their abstentions become positive votes when it comes to sending signals on human rights and supporting women and girls? It's also worrying, as we've heard, about the policy now of Iran with Russia for drones and diplomacy in arms and fuel, and indeed citing those BRICS countries. And it is alarming to see the BRICS network becoming a de facto diplomatic network as a cover for Russia. We've seen this within the recent military exercises from Iran, but we also saw that with the naval exercises of our allies in South Africa. I hope that the Minister can give clarity as to what our diplomatic work are doing to ensure that Iran is isolated as it should be. As the noble Lord Haney had indicated, it is jarring to see Iranians excluded from the expedited or amnesty from irregular routes announced today. Why is this the case? And can the Minister state, in clear terms, what is the safe route for an Iranian woman to seek asylum in the UK? Iranians, according to the government, were the second highest of countries who sought asylum in 2021, 9,652. What signal are we saying that we have not put in place safe routes for asylum for those that are seeking refuge in the UK? And finally, with regards to the point that have been raised so well in the debate with regards to the BBC, On the 12th of October, over 4 months ago, I raised an urgent question in the Chamber, seeking urgent emergency funding, even if temporary, to secure the future of BBC Persian radio service. This is now the time to ensure that the people of Iran, understand, benefit and can receive information from an independent, impartial and free media at exactly the time that is being denied of them by their own government. And I hope the government can provide at least emergency funding to ensure that service is not stopped at the end of March.
My Lords, I too congratulate the Noble Lords for securing the timely debate when the spotlight's on British-Iranian relations, and we are again seeing a further widespread wave of uprisings across Iran. My noble friend Lord Collins has spoken fervently on a number of occasions on the need for continuing support for the protesters and is sorry not to be here today due to his role in the bill currently in the main chamber. The debate is about priorities for British-Iranian relations, and we've had a number of expert and very moving contributions from all noble lords on these. I will underline 4 key issues. The regime's brutal crackdown against protesters has been an appalling response to extraordinary bravery, viewed alongside Tehran's military threat to our allies through its proxies and its arms sales. The UK government must respond firmly and consistently. As we've heard, the flow of Iranian drones to Russia in support of its illegal war against Ukraine has been a stark warning about the regime's threat beyond its borders. The continuing presence of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps demonstrates that security threat right here in the UK, and the chilling MI5 evidence of threats by the Iranian regime on British individuals, including British-Iranian journalists, at least 15 potential threats on British individuals in the last year alone. The Intelligence and Security Committee has warned of state-sponsored assassination and is undertaking a report into Iran. Can the Minister confirm that the committee is urgently receiving all the information and support it needs from the government? The IRGC needs to be a prescribed organisation in the UK, so why has the government not yet done so? Secondly, our policy towards Iran must be a reflection of our values as well as the national interest, and standing up for human rights a priority for Britain's diplomacy across the region, particularly standing unequivocally against the death penalty in Iran and calling out the barbaric and politically motivated treatment and execution of protesters, including of British national Reza Pahlavi. We also stand with Iranian journalists and freedom of expression, including here in the UK. Following Tuesday's statement in the House, my noble friend Lord Coker emphasised during the debate in support of the government's statement that we must make the UK a safe place for journalists and others speaking the truth to power. We can never allow tyranny or authoritarianism to be exported to the UK. In the light of the summoning of the Iranian charge d'affaires, can the Minister update on the meetings and discussions that have been held with Iranian officials on what has been said by Iranians of any possible explanation for their actions? Thirdly, when the UK pays tribute to the brave protesters, we must also support their demands for the fundamental reform to live their lives as they choose. My House of Commons colleagues have led the calls for the government to bring forward extra sanctions against the regime, and we welcome the new sanctions announced earlier this week in relation to the IRGC. Can the Minister confirm that the FCDO will continue to engage with international partners to ensure our sanctions reflect those of our closest allies? Finally, just quickly on the potential for the JCPOA, I want to stress our view that the government is right to support a diplomatic solution to address Iran's nuclear escalation. I look forward to the Minister's response.
My Lords, may I begin by, as others have done so, thanking and recognising the Noble Lord Alton for his continued advocacy on important issues of human rights, and on Iran this is no exception. And may I say, whilst I recognise the different points that have been raised, both on a personal level and as a minister, including in my capacity as Minister for Human Rights, I assure all noble lords, irrespective of their contributions, that the principles that they have articulated are very clear to me. And in terms of my own capacity as a minister, the advocacy I make internally, whilst I can't speak to detail, is something that perhaps will resonate with noble lords in terms of private discussions that are taking place, and I assure noble lords of my best efforts in this regard. we all recognise, and the debates today have shown, as my noble friend Lord Shinkwin reminded us, that Iran's irrepressible behaviour has escalated, abhorrent behaviour has escalated in recent months. It's very clear. Since the start of 2022, there have been 15 credible threats to kill or kidnap British or UK-based individuals by the Iranian regime. And of course I recognise the point made by the Noble Lord Alton about the sanctioning which has been perpetrated against both him and my noble friend Lord Pollock. And it is different. In all my time as a minister, I've never seen the strength and the need to brief all parliamentarians about the risks of the Iranian threat to us here in the United Kingdom. Most recently, we've seen the brazen behaviour of the regime targeting journalists and their families in the UK. And of course, I can give Baroness Cousins raise the importance of 3 points, which I'll come to, but the last of the 3 points she raised, also articulated by the Noble Lord Purvis, yes, I can give that assurance. We work very closely with the families of journalists. If there are particular instances which Noble Lords pick up of specific areas of concern, they should be flagged firstly to the police, but also if they are made known to us within government. Whilst we can't talk in detail, we will seek to ensure that appropriate protections and advice are provided. Over the last 6 months, we have seen the regime's brutal crackdown on protesters who are fighting for their basic freedoms. Many noble lords referred to this. And at the same time, the regime continues to provide support to Russia in its appalling and brutal legal war. And I'm sure I speak for all noble lords that as I watch the clock, that later today we shall see another vote at the UN General Assembly in favour of Ukraine, I hope, and we have been lobbying hard to ensure many countries across the region where Iran is based also recognise the importance of Iran's destabilising actions, not just in the region, but right here in Europe as well. And as Noble Lords also articulated, Iran's nuclear programme is now more advanced than ever, and I will come on to that in a moment. The Noble Lord Delakia talked about Iranians in the UK. We do take a measured approach. I recognise the points the Noble Lord made in engaging with both the Iranian civil society and the diaspora in the UK. We are also clear that the choice of Iran's government ultimately will be a matter for the Iranian people. The Noble Lady Baroness Deach was right to raise concerns about the Islamic Centre here in England. And on the 14th of November 2022, the Charity Commission actually did approve and started and opened a statutory inquiry into the charity due to serious governance concerns that have been raised. And we are following that very, very closely. But of course, I note the points that the Noble Lady raised. Let me also address the repeated threats to UK-based individuals. Over the past year, we've seen credible threats, which I've alluded to, and this includes very real and specific threats towards UK-based journalists working for Iran International. Whilst there's been much speculation, I assure Noble Lords that we are working across government, and as my right honourable friend said in the other place, we are working together with Iran International to ensure the protection of their activities both here and indeed the important work that they do. This hostile behaviour is unacceptable, and we will not tolerate attempts to threaten, intimidate or harm anyone in the UK. We will also not tolerate direct attacks on media freedom. There are threats to our fundamental values and freedom of expression and media. Turning, if I may, to BBC Persian, as the Noble Lady Baroness Cousins said, I could articulate what I said before about our support for the broader service, but let me be very clear to the Noble Lord Alton, the Right Reverend Prelate, Bishop of St Albans, Lord Hannay, Lord Purvis, Baroness Cousins. Indeed, all more or less contributions today have focused in on BBC Persia. It is right, and I recognise the valuable service it provides. I also recognise that we are in a very different phase to where we were when certain decisions were taken, even, say, 6 to 12 months ago. Therefore, I will, of course, take note of the immense strength of feeling. I can't give the assurances the Noble Lord Hannay is seeking at this time, but let me please, again, take that back. As I said, I share many of the concerns that have been raised, and I do recognise, whilst it's a small proportion of the service provided by BBC Radio Persia, it's an important service, particularly under the current circumstances. And on turning to some of the other specific actions, on the 20th of February, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, Noble Lady Baroness Wheeler, alluded to this, about our summoning of the Chargé, Iran's most senior diplomat in London. so that we could make a more protest about Iran's intolerable threats in the UK and to warn against any further activity. You know, it shocks me. I've had various conversations with the Chargé, and I've put it very bluntly to him that they are actually killing their next generation, put all the other issues aside. Some of the people who have been executed in terms of ages and indeed their contributions to Iran. It's shocking to see the regime acting in the way it does. What answer do they have to share the answer? The answer is nothing. How can you respond to that? But I assure all noble lords will continue to work closely with law enforcement to both identify, deter and respond to emerging threats. And as my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, made clear earlier this week, we will work closely with our allies in a unified response. I know Noble Lady Baroness Wheeler and Noble Lord Purvis also raised these issues. Of course, we're working hand in glove with our allies because this is a threat which is real not to those just in the region, but also across the world. Turning to the protests in Iran, the Noble Lord Alton, the Noble Lord Pollock, the Noble Lady Baroness Cousins and others raised this particular issue. I've already alluded to the fact that how do you deal with a regime that is so brutal to its own people? Yet we will stay focused and work with our allies in this respect. The issue of holding the regime to account was raised by the Noble Lord Alton and others. 5 months have passed since the tragic incident and the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, which we discussed in your Lordship's house, after she was arrested by Iran's so-called morality police, which sparked protests. We have seen brave Iranian people stand up for their basic rights and freedom. The Noble Lord Alton asked about specific records. Of course, it's difficult, but we have estimated more than 500 people have now died, over 18,000 people have been arrested, 1,500 injured, and tragically, some of those numbers include about 65 children, if not more. Their demand is a simple one, for a better future, and we stand by that. The Iranian people, it is quite clear, will no longer tolerate the violence and oppression of a regime which is putting its own interests above theirs, and the UK is working in international fora and directly on this issue. On Monday, we sanctioned 8 individuals for horrific human rights violations, including the killing of children. And last month, we sanctioned the Basij Resistance Force for its brutal repression on the streets of Iran. My noble friend Lord Pollock, rightly, along with the Noble Lady Baroness Wheeler, indeed all, the Noble Lady Baroness each asked the questions around the IRGC. The UK maintains sanctions on over 300 individuals and entities for their roles in Iran's human rights violation, and this includes the IRGC in its entirety, and of course further sanctions have been imposed on key individuals. I'm not going to speculate about our future response, but I've heard again very clearly where Noble Lords stand on this, and what I can share with Noble Lords, we're working very closely across government on the very issues the Noble Lords have raised, particularly in relation to the point on prescription. Turning briefly to the important issue of human rights more generally, to my noble friend Lord McCall, I listened very carefully to his contribution, and what I would say at this juncture, that what is very clear, and I want to reassure him, that the sanctions which are imposed, indeed any sanction which is being imposed on the Iranian regime, has the appropriate carve-outs that allows us to provide that basic humanitarian support and indeed medical support that is needed. And of course, as we currently are increasing sanctions, they are being felt by the regime, they are having an impact. And at the moment, I think doing anything which would seek to alleviate and in any way recognise something beyond humanitarian and medical support, I think is not the right time. The Noble Lord Purvis also raised the right, and I've been following it myself, it's a question I asked about asylum seekers and the pathways, and I assure Noble Lords that I will be following this up directly with colleagues at the Home Office. Whilst it's a matter for them, I do recognise that Iranians are, for example, eligible for the resettlement scheme. It's a global scheme which will start in March 2021, but also the need for safe routes in taking asylum is very crucial, and we need to remain focused on that. My Lords, in the interest of time, as I run short, I would just assure Noble Lords that the Noble Lord Pollack suggested about our human rights and work we've done there. He will know the action we've taken at the CSW. I thank my noble friend in that respect. And I assure all noble lords that we will use the 52nd session of the UK Human Rights Council to make clear our views on Iran's credibility when it comes to human rights issues. In terms of Iran supporting Russia, this illegal war continues. Iran is profiteering for this. The Noble Lord Purvis made an important point about BRICS. I assure the Noble Lord we waste no opportunity in the context of our G7 representations to countries who perhaps aren't sharing the same view, the importance of acting together. And on the issue of their wider destabilization, I recently met this week with the Foreign Minister of Yemen, and I was in the Gulf last week, again aligning ourselves fully in strengthening our alliance against Iran's destabilizing influences, and we will continue to work hand in glove. On the issue of the nuclear threat, of course, this grows ever more increasing. I will, of course, write to noble lords specifically on where we've got to, but I assure we are watching this continuing threat. It is not in any way, as the noble Lady Baroness Deach said, a comprehensive deal. The deal has been ready for signing for some months now. Iran has not moved, and the challenge is ever increasing on issues of nuclear enrichment. And I appreciate, in particular, the noble Lord Hanne's valuable insights in this respect. And we will move, yes, with our partners, carefully, forwardly, because the ultimate objective must be that we do not allow Iran to gain nuclear weapons. To conclude, my lords, I will write in further detail on that very important point, just to give exactly where we are. But I welcome this debate, and like the noble Lord Alton, I recognise that in 1 hour on a subject of such gravity we cannot cover. And I have spoken to officials earlier today and before. We will look to see whether we can arrange an appropriate briefing at the FCDO, perhaps including colleagues from the Home Office, so that we can give noble lords a more detailed insight on our current work, and of course valuably listen to their advice as well.
That completes the business before the Grand Committee this afternoon. The committee is adjourned.
Moses Room, South.
Ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding